Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast, bringing you what's new in the PowerShell world straight to your earlobes. And today we have a very special guest, a very exciting episode. I find it's awesome to celebrate the community and how we can all work together and how, we're all bigger and better than just being by ourselves. But also I think it's worth highlighting the people who are quite exceptional and prolific in their module writing. And that is who we have joining us today. We'll get to him soon. If you haven't yet, check out the PDQ Discord, discord.gg/PDQ. There's a PowerShell scripting channel in there with a lot of cool buzz. I actually have some questions for Justin from Discord. So first of all, I want to shout out Jeff Hicks. He had an update to the PowerShell scripting and toolmaking. So I own this book, bought it years ago, and it's cool. It's from Lean Pub, so you can get the updates. So shout out Jeff. A lot of awesome work went into that. And if you haven't yet, check out his newsletter. He's got some cool stuff rolling around out there. Now, a little bit of a pivot. So this is a surprise to our guest, but I'd like to bring him out a little earlier because he has some insight into some of the other news items that I have for this week. So I'd like to introduce Justin Grote to the PowerShell podcast. Welcome, Justin.
I'm scared. I'm not prepared. My cue was earlier in the play.
I know, but like you're sipping water.
This is like when they do those plays where the performers are on the fifth week and they just start doing things to intentionally trip other people up. So
that's it. I mean, you're a returning guest, so you're used to this. Now, I brought you on because I'm going to talk about the AZ accounts version 3.0 issues, which you actually had some firsthand experience with.
Yeah, so it's funny. I encountered it. So for those who don't know, there is a new 3.0 version of the AZ accounts module. And what they mostly did, they have a blog post they were talking about when they were going to do this, that they were going to sort of change how the Connect AZ account works to make it easier, to give you sort of ways to present a list, to select a subscription, all that kind of thing. But with most major new changes, they implemented it. They probably fixed a bunch of things, and in the process, broke a few things. So the one thing that I ran into was the most common thing is that when you go to do a login, it can't pop up the interactive web browser thing to do the login. And so I was actually live on a P1 issue with a customer. And they were basically having an issue with Azure file shares. Their Kerberos had got all messed up. My guess is that the password basically had expired, and they just didn't know. But they had already gone through and done a bunch of stuff to completely obliterate what the configuration was before. So I have no way of turning if that was the problem. Anyhow, so in order to fix it, I was like, okay, well, how about we just re-register this file share account, re-register that Kerberos principal so that your users can authenticate that file share again and start working. So the best way to do this is, of course, PowerShell. There is a PowerShell module that's published by the team that automates the whole process of joining to the domain, getting the special Kerberos ticket, and then publishing that up to the file share and getting it configured. It's real nice, real slick. However, it does use AZ, and the module doesn't specify what version of AZ to use. So when we had to do the install fresh for a system, it ended up pulling the 3.0 version of the module. And when we went to go to connect, we ran into the problem that most people are having, which is that the interactive window will sort of come up and fail, or it'll give you a wall of red about it. So the workaround in our case was, we'll just use device code. And so have it just pop up the text and then go do the interactive login somewhere else. And so we did that. But yeah, sure enough, it was a thing that, live on a call in a production down situation, I was like, never seen that before. It wasn't ready for that. So, yeah, so that's my experience with that particular issue.
That sounds like a conference talk, like when you actually try and use the tech, everything goes wrong, except you're with customers.
Yeah, and I had no idea that was I just assumed because we were doing it on a server that there was just something I didn't understand about the server until I saw the news 3 days later. And then I was like, oh, that's probably what that problem was.
So for those who don't know, what is your day job?
So I'm a Datacenter Solutions Architect is my fancy title, but the way I always explain it with my customers, I work for an MSP, which is a managed service provider, which basically we basically take over people's IT departments who don't want to run them anymore. It's you get your water, you get your sewer, you get your electricity all through utilities. With companies more and more, is why not have your IT driven that same way? And so I'm generally on the forefront of getting those services onboarding. I'm in the friction where the rubber meets the road. And so I do whatever is necessary to help get a customer onboarded. And where PowerShell really helps me in that regard is anytime I come across a thing where we have an issue or something doesn't quite work right with our systems, or maybe they have a different HR system that nobody's ever seen before, I can use PowerShell more quickly than using any other language to whip up some glue code to get that integrated and get that customer onboarded. So the way I usually describe it is the movie Pulp Fiction. There's a character played by Harvey Keitel called the Wolf, and he just comes in and he just fixes problems. And so I always that gets referenced a lot with me when I'm coming in. I'm there to do whatever, whether it's computing, storage. I have such a broad background of a lot of years of IT that doesn't matter what it is. So my job is different day to day, and I have a new customer every 6 months, so if not less. So even though I've been with the same company for over 15 years, it doesn't feel that way. Like I've had the same wonderful boss, the same wonderful environment to work in, but I'm constantly changing customers, constantly working with different environments, so it keeps it fresh.
So I've been learning a lot about MSPs lately. I went to an MSP conference last week, and I can tell you what, MSP sounds so interesting to me because you get to experience different environments, but ultimately with something like PowerShell, you can work on how you implement these things in your processes. And as you keep on acquiring new customers and get to experience new environments, you can take a lot of that skill set with you. And I feel like it really feels like you're building and improving systems when you're working at an MSP. And I feel like they're more encouraged to do that compared to a lot of other IT teams that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, MSPs are cultures in and of themselves, and just like IT departments, there's many different kinds. There are many different MSP cultures. So I can't say like, oh yeah, all MSPs work this particular way. They're vastly different. It really depends on like, do they focus on a particular vertical? They're going to have, it's just like any other company. It's just the way that it's targeted is different. The great thing about being an MSP is that you are a driver of revenue. You are not a cost center, and so there tends to be a lot more impetus and focus on our autonomy and our ability to do things, as opposed to just being like, try to do things as cheaply as possible because you're just seen as a cost center, not a force multiplier. That's a struggle that a lot of people have in IT departments that I have the wonderful luxury of not having, is because I'm on the front end of driving revenue. And so that helps a lot to get what I want, what I need, be happy. So
would you encourage other people maybe in their careers to experience MSP life? I guess a good MSP, right?
Yeah, I mean, even a bad MSP is good too, because it's it's not for everyone. It really depends on if you aren't good at managing a work-life balance. It can take you over like anything else, just more so with an MSP. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, if you're comfortable in corporate IT environments, and again, I see the nice thing that I like about being an MSP is that I've seen everybody's different IT cultures, but I only have to live in them for like 2 to 3 weeks max, like 6 months to a year, and then occasional visits after. So if you like changing cultures and you're not really beholden to any particular environment or a group, or you don't like get your friends from work, like I'm very mercenary in the way that I approach my work, and so that like it can be very attractive to certain types of people. And we are very careful. We have a very detailed like selection process that we go through with selecting members of our team, especially members of my team, which is known as the hypercare team. That we're looking for certain breeds. It's like CIA selection kind of a deal. It's like we usually when we get on the phone with somebody, we know in like the first 30 seconds to 2 minutes whether they're going to be a good candidate or not. So it takes a very specific mixture of high technical skill and really good soft skills, because shaping the message of what's going on is incredibly important in an MSP. So
very cool. And this is me making an assumption, but whenever I see you and what you talk about, you seem to have a pretty large working set of technologies that you have kind of ready to speak about with experience. And I think that this is me making an assumption from what you've said, but I think a lot of that comes from the fact that you're hands-on with a lot of this technology regularly. So it's not like, oh yeah, you learned it for this one project and haven't used it in 2 years since implementing it. It's like, no, used it. And it kind of fits in nicely with your public facing role where you're sharing knowledge with others and sort of being a beacon and Microsoft MVP. So it's kind of cool how it all sort of works together for you.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite sayings is like, you can't Google problems that happen to Google, because they're happening at such large scales and they're so unique that So there's a lot of stuff that I do that if it's not uncharted territory completely, it's at least uncharted territory for the vast majority of people working in it. And so my ability to sort of both, work with people and gain trust in order to get the access to do the work that I need, and the ability to really dive into something technically and explore those fringe, go off the reservation a bit while still developing a supported solution, really, really helps in those areas of that. And I'm being purposely vague because it's all kinds of different things. I mean, one I could talk about because I talk about all the time is, the ticketing integration that we did, I made with an Azure function. It now processes 4 million tickets a month, and it only costs like $7 a month to run. And that's all in Azure Functions serverless, and it scales up and scales down. And that's just one example of a thing that I've built. And it was just to solve a problem. It was, we need to integrate these two systems. Okay, we could pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get it done with a certain way. Or I could just write it in an Azure function in a couple of days. And because it scales for me, I don't have to design that infrastructure, and the cost made sense. And so, yeah, and like it's code I haven't touched in years, and it still runs, and it's at 100% uptime since it was deployed. So that's just like an example of the many things. But a lot of my other day-to-days is working with customers. A lot of that, it's a lot of my stuff is actually very soft skills type stuff. Is shaping messages, helping like reduce frictions, like anywhere like in an onboarding process, somebody gets really hesitant about like the credentials we might need or the way that we onboard. So they bring me in to help discuss that. If there's a major issue with the customer, I come in, and even if I don't know exactly the details of the technical problem that there's there, I'm good at like wrangling what are the requirements, what is broken, what is the solution, what has changed, and then getting people wrangled to get that stuff done if I'm not the one doing the fixing myself. So
Nice.
just a lot of that fast-paced type stuff I really enjoy because it keeps my brain engaged. So
You mentioned APIs and ticketing systems, and I think that if you have some good PowerShell knowledge and you're looking for projects and ways to implement it, and you have a ticketing system that you're interacting with, Azure Functions is a great pivot point if you need it. But check out what kind of value you can bring to your ticketing system, how you can interact with it, what kind of problem you can solve. I had a lot of fun with that earlier in my career, and APIs in general, having an excuse to learn how they work, get some hands-on time with that is going to pay dividends throughout your career.
yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I mean, I've probably played with dozens, if not hundreds of APIs over the years. I've made tools that auto-generate based on API spec things. And yeah, once you get, especially thankfully that most of the world is pretty much standardized on, if not purely REST, something that's sort of REST-like in terms of everything uses HTTPS now. There's not a lot of like DC RPC call type stuff anymore. And so because everything's so standard discoverable, the tools are standardized, things like code and using packet inspectors like Fiddler, and then using tools like Thunder Client or Postman or whatever your preference is.
Oh, I wouldn't say not Postman anymore.
Well, I mean, yeah, I know this is the privacy thing that everybody's got their knickers bunched up about, but I mean, I don't think it's that big of a deal. But
I thought there was some leak. Was there not a leak as well?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a whole. Regardless of that point, I mean, the main thing just being that, whatever tools you use, learning the ins and outs of invoke REST method and invoke web request, especially in PowerShell 7, how those were rewritten and using a whole new base engine and being much more powerful. That's one of those areas, when we talk about like the sacred vow, is once you learn how to process an API, it becomes so much easier for the next one and the next one and the next one. And so when people see like something comes out and I just churn out a module to have an interaction with that, it's just because I've done it so many times that I know pretty much how it's going to go, and I know the roadblocks I'm going to run into for the most part, at least in terms of clearing most of the simple stuff. And then the other roadblocks are just eccentricities with the API itself.
Yeah, but it is such a helpful thing to have in your tool set. So much good use of it. And honestly, Azure Functions is as well. Here's a question. Can I consider myself an Azure architect because I designed and implemented an Azure function? Do you give me that go ahead?
Absolutely. I'm not a gatekeeper about titles and again, like I say, like my title is Datacenter Solutions Architect. Okay, what does that even mean? I mean, it basically means what I say. I mean, I've had all kinds of weird titles over the years. This was like, as a tangent, as I like to do. I remember like there was an IBM article about, God, it must have been 20 years ago that I read. And one of my favorite things is like, it was like in the 2000s, like, .com stuff. And they were talking about like all the new job roles that would exist. And one of the ones that was in there has always stuck with me was they made I think it was kind of tongue in cheek, but they said that there would be thought jockeys, is that there were people who would wrangle the zeitgeist and that kind of thing. I just thought jockey is just such a weird title, but you could totally see it. And now that we have things like LLMs that weren't even perceivable back then, the idea of being a prompt jockey is like the idea of that, the realization of that concept. And I just always like that. Like, I don't get hung up on titles. I believe if you've ever written a single line of PowerShell, you are a developer. I don't care about scripting versus developing versus any of that.
Yeah.
I don't care what your title is. I care what you can do for me. And that's what matters.
Totally agree.
If you say you're an architect and you can't do it, then so what? I don't care if you have the paper that says you can. That doesn't matter.
No, don't sign me up for the big jobs. Just the Azure function, simple connecting things. But it is so nice to have that pivot point in Azure and to have it be not expensive. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's great experience if you haven't done anything in Azure as well. It's kind of concentrated with what you're actually going to be interacting with. A lot of good guides out there. A lot of cool stuff. The last thing I had on my pre-show notes that I want to shout out is a blog from Harm Veenstra, PowerShellIsFun.com. Keep Microsoft Teams status available instead of away using PowerShell. So check out that blog. Justin, have you checked out the Teams API module?
A bit. There's like the Presence API and such. I don't tend to do a lot of like client stuff. It's just not really my world. I like to stay away from endpoints because it keeps me away from users. But I get involved there from time to time, and I have done stuff like that in the past. I mean, there's always like the janky way where you just have something that like runs auto hotkey that just like hits your control key very quickly every like 5 minutes or something to keep your status. But I remember back in the days of like ICQ and that kind of thing. I used to make some fancy things to like which is sadly going away. But in those things, like I would make little things here and there for like setting custom statuses of like setting what the current music I was listening to from Winamp and that kind of thing, or whatnot.
Yeah.
So all these old decrepit things that I don't do anymore and everybody does it far better than now. So I'm always a believer in that, like, if it exists, why would I reinvent it? Back then it didn't exist. So I just made it. It was a fun thing to do. So, and I learned a lot. But yeah, I haven't done that much with the Teams API, with the exception of that I've made a couple like interactive bots using the bot framework that would tie into. Basically, I made a version that would let you use bot framework with PowerShell so that you could register it, and you could register with Facebook, you could register with Slack, all those. Like, you couldn't register with Discord because bot framework doesn't work with Discord for some reason. But basically, it's very similar to what Brandon Dev Black Ops made called PowerBot, which is what most people know, or Poshbot, which is what most people know. But his version is sort of more bespoke. My version actually uses the Microsoft Azure Bot framework. It uses the SDK for that. And so it abstracts a lot of the stuff of making cards and that kind of stuff and making it work across all kinds of different platforms. And I used it for a couple things that we had in work of recommendation engines and whatnot, but I don't really do much with that anymore. So that's about as close as I get. I didn't really work the Teams API directly, but I kind of did via the bot framework, which that piece did all the Teams work for me.
Nice. Is that module published, or was that just an internal thing?
I think it's a gist somewhere in my thing, somewhere.
Okay.
I think I published it, but I mean, it's certainly not usable compared to what I have published privately. So I published some basic stuff that I could sanitize. So
nice. I also want to give a shout out. If you haven't seen my shirt, if you're not watching the video, it says Git-PowerShell tip install module tips. So shout out to Deadly Dog for that module, and check it out if you haven't. And I appreciate the shirt. I'm wearing it. It's warm. It's snuggy. We're talking about modules a little bit. Tips is a module. You have a lot of really awesome modules. I want to talk about your modules. I want to get some insights into how your developer workflow, how it works into your daily life, and why you find yourself writing these modules. But let's get started with some of your modules. So one that is really cool that I've heard a lot of great things about is ModuleFast. Now, what is ModuleFast? And the name kind of might give it away.
So first of all, thanks. That's very kind of you. I appreciate that. As far as ModuleFast goes, ModuleFast is a PowerShell. It's just a PowerShell module. It's all written in PowerShell with the exception of one library very recently that I added. Anyhow, ModuleFast is a way to install modules faster. It is designed primarily for the installation part of modules, not the entire life cycle of like uninstalling or finding. But what is there for is that if you know what modules you want to install, and you know either the specific version or version ranges that you want, even if that just means whatever the latest version of, then ModuleFast allows you to, in a declarative manner similar to Terraform or other tools, declare what modules you want installed. And ModuleFast will install those modules in the fastest way possible using pure PowerShell. And so it does that by optimizing a lot of things. It optimizes a lot of the process to be as parallel as possible in terms of fetching information, determining dependencies, and then pulling down, extracting, and installing the modules. And then I also have a second component called pwsh.gallery, which it uses by default, which takes the default PowerShell gallery, which is basically a SQL server that is a NuGet version 2 front end. And I take that and I proxy that through a thing called Cloudflare Workers, which is sort of like Azure Functions, but they're written in TypeScript. They're super small and they're super powerful and go to like 150 data centers immediately. And so that provides a sort of edge layer that translates NuGet version 2 to NuGet version 3. So ModuleFast works completely with NuGet version 3. And NuGet version 3 is much more cacheable. And so it is able to fetch modules very quickly, fetch all the information about modules, the metadata about their dependencies, and then install them super quick. And so it does a lot of stuff other than that, has some fancy syntax. But the main thing that it does, it allows you to install modules very quickly. So if you want to do it interactively, great. But especially in like continuous integration into continuous deployment scenarios where you're downloading modules constantly, or you want to make sure that they stay within certain versions. A perfect example is maybe you want to peg your AZ to not go to 3.0 in your build scripts because you know it works with 2.0. And if a 3.0 comes out, you want to be able to review that and then upgrade it and not break your pipeline. Perfect example to use ModuleFast. You tell ModuleFast, install all AZ modules except for up to all 2x modules you can install. But if a 3x comes out, don't change the way that I do my testing. And so you can break it, learn about that break, you realize, oh, it didn't break my workflow, but I'll need to investigate that before I make that change in my declarative workflow, as opposed to just putting an install module and such. So it's mostly there for that, to be able to install modules really, really quickly so that when you're doing it in places that you're doing it over and over and over again, like GitHub Actions, continuous workflows, or even just day-to-day of like building a new machine or in a container, that kind of thing. It's mostly there to get those modules on the system as fast as possible. But it's also very useful for interactive use. When you're just on a computer, you want to get a new module, it fetches it much faster than the current options.
Interesting. And you can, so say I have a script that needs some other modules, I can use that maybe as a line near the top of the script, and it will get those modules for me. Yeah,
so the way that ModuleFast works is that it has a bootstrap script, so you don't even have to install a module of ModuleFast to use it. You can just do IWR bit.ly/ModuleFast pipe IEX, and you have ModuleFast. And that's all you got to do, and you have it running. And then you can do install ModuleFast, or IMF for short, which it has an alias for, and then do whatever you want. If you do the help for install ModuleFast, it has all kinds of examples of how you can do it. And there's a lot of options. You can just do it at the command line. It has a very nice little like short string syntax as opposed to that big long like hash table module specification syntax for specifying certain versions or version ranges. And as far as installing the dependencies for scripts, there's a lot of options there. You can just do it in a file. You can make, there's this old module that was made by a Rambling Cookie Monster called psdepend, which had this requirements.psd1 file. You can use that format and use that. You can use a custom format for ModuleFast, which basically uses the same syntax at the command line. It also now can read the requires out of a module. So if you just put, if you have a script that has pound requires at the top, or a module that has pound requires at the top, and it has the module and the versions, you can just say install ModuleFast and point it to that script, and it will install the dependencies for that script. And it works for modules too. If you have modules in your required modules, dependencies of your PSD1, your module manifest, you just say install ModuleFast, point it to that manifest, or if you're already just in the directory, just say install ModuleFast, and it will detect that file, and it will find the required modules and install them. So again, it's great for CI builds where you don't have to have a separate step of figuring out what modules to install. You just point it at your module and it'll install your dependencies so that you can then test it.
Sweet. So where does PS Resource Get fit into all this? Is that more of kind of the solution for people who are in their day-to-day personal machine?
Yeah, so ModuleFast is very clear right up front when you go to the GitHub and everything, is that is a loose and fast way to do things. It doesn't have retry logic, so if a connection, it expects that you're on a fast connection, in a data center running GitHub Actions, that kind of stuff. So if something happens that it loses a connection or a connection gets reset, it's just going to fail and you're going to retry. It is built to be idempotent so that you can just keep retrying it until it works and you'll get a final result. It won't. It's built to be declarative, just like Terraform or those other things. But it is primarily meant to be that fast and loose solution. Just get modules installed. It's not meant to manage the entire module lifecycle. There are no find functions in it for finding modules. That's what psget and psResourceGit are meant for. And psget and psResourceGit have a very large challenge in front of them in that the teams that have to manage those have to think about all the past users, and they wanted to make it to be as non-breaking changes as possible. I don't have to do that in ModuleFast. ModuleFast doesn't support PowerShell 5.1. It only supports PowerShell 7+. psget does. So what I do with ModuleFast are because I can get away with things, and I have certain rules where I'm defining, I'm not worrying about a lot of legacy stuff. I allow for some legacy stuff, but for the most part, I'm not having to deal with things that psResourceGit and PowerShell Git, which also PowerShell Git version 3 is known as psResourceGit, if there are people who don't know that. It's just now known as psResourceGit. So there are things that I do with ModuleFast that I don't have to worry about. And so I can be faster because I'm not doing certain kinds of checks. And I don't have as much compatibility to worry about as that team does.
Nice. And you mentioned GitHub Actions. I know you're giving a talk on that in the future, but so it integrates GitHub Action would be a great way to use it.
Yeah. In fact, it has a GitHub Action. If you go to my GitHub's JustinGrote/ModuleFast-Action, there is a GitHub Action for it in the marketplace where you can just click. If you go to the marketplace action, you search for ModuleFast, you'll see it. And you can say use the action, and it'll explain how to use it. But you won't have to know anything about installing the script or that kind of stuff. The GitHub Action takes care of it for you, and you can put it right in there in your steps. And by default, if you have a requires, or you have a requires in your script, or you have a module manifest, by default, you don't have to configure it at all. You can just use the default, and it will do some rudimentary discovery and just work without you even having to configure it. That's all detailed there in the GitHub page as well.
Yeah. Pretty extensive README. Appreciate good documentation. Thank you for that, Justin. So any contributors on this?
Not too much. And part of the reason will be if you ever go in and look at the code, I've basically done more or less there's a lot of low-level .NET stuff done in there that it's basically like being written in C# without being written in C#. There's a lot of work with the HTTP client on the raw. I don't even use invoke web request and invoke REST method because there's overhead involved with those commands that if I just go straight to the raw HTTP client, which those things use underneath, I can do certain things faster and more things in parallel. And that's the big thing is a lot of what psResourceGit does currently is it's all done in serial. So if you're installing modules, it's installing them, installs a module, and then goes and finds the info about the next module, and then installs that module, and then goes and finds the next module and installs that module. And there are things about the PowerShell gallery, every request to the PowerShell gallery takes 500 milliseconds currently. Hence why I made that caching layer that speeds things up. So there's a lot of things like that, the biggest thing that psResourceGit and they've committed to doing is that just installing the modules in parallel, just by doing that part, they'll get 80% of the way of what ModuleFast does. But ModuleFast does a lot of other very fancy things. It will, as it downloads, it decompresses in memory so that when it writes to disk, it doesn't even save the zip file to disk. It decompresses the zip file using a streaming method in .NET so that it can uncompress the zip file and write it to disk. So the only thing that gets written to disk, which is the slowest part, is the actual module. I don't even save the zip file intermediary. It unzips it on the fly in memory and then writes it out so that it can be even faster on that. In fact, to max it out, I had to build a 64 core system with 2 ultra SSDs in Azure just to hit the bottleneck where it wasn't the disk performance, that the bottleneck was actually the network pulling stuff down at 10 gigabit speeds. So it was a fun experiment that I did, and I get a very big, generous Azure sponsorship as part of being an MVP, so I can do that kind of a thing.
I was wondering who paid for that, but nice. Shout out Microsoft.
In fact, that's what also paid for the transcription project that I did for the PowerShell podcast as a funny, fun little. That I was going to do as a lightning demo at Summit, but I ended up doing at the RTP SUG, which was
fun. So what is this thing? And by the way, I watched your lightning demo at the RTP SUG. But what is this transcription Azure PowerShell podcast infusion that you came up with?
So it was just a fun thing that I did that I found like I get the good feelies whenever I get mentioned on the podcast. I'm like, this is great. It's like it's fun. And so I was like, I do listen to pretty much every episode, but like, what if I want to go back and find like what particular timestamp was at and that kind of thing? It was just a funny idea. I was like, well, I wanted an excuse to play with Azure Speech Service. So it was an excuse to do that in Azure Cognitive Services. So I basically, what it does is you can take audio files and feed it to the Azure Speech Service, and it will transcribe those and pull all the words out. It basically does like sort of like the YouTube auto comments, but like done in Azure. And so by feeding it that, I now have all these text files that are basically the transcriptions, and it does. I'm not going to say it's not didactics or diacritics or something like that. Basically, it can distinguish between speakers, so it can say speaker 1, speaker 2, and be able to have that. And so to pull all that information, and so now all that's just basically in text. So take that text and load it into one of my favorite tools, which is Azure Data Explorer, which is what powers like Azure Log Analytics and Sentinel and that kind of stuff. It's a really great format for storing that kind of data and querying it using things like KQL and whatnot. So take that information, put it into that, and then run. And now you basically just have a big database that is all the words ever said on the PowerShell podcast. And then now you just query it like you would anything else. And so it's just a fun way to do that. And then based on that, I made a PowerShell module that does all kinds of fun queries, like builds a leaderboard of every time certain people have been mentioned. Or the one that I demoed as well was that using VLC, since VLC can grab a MP3 and go to a particular timestamp pretty easy at the command line, and in the metadata of everything that thing transcribes, it says when the thing was said and on what episode. Take that metadata, feed it to VLC to go transparently grab the MP3 and play it, so that I could grab a random time that I mentioned and just play it. And unfortunately, it didn't quite work in the demo because of audio things of like playing from a computer and having it record. I thought I had it fixed, but I didn't, but I later posted it. But so it was fun every time I could just play a little ego boost of every time just a random time I was mentioned on the podcast. So it was just fun. It was a fun thing. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about Azure Speech Service. I had to write a PowerShell module because there wasn't one that existed for it. But it was you learn APIs. It's a pretty straightforward REST-based GET POST type API. So you just have to learn the idiosyncrasies of their network, but all the stuff is just all invoke REST method, and it's in the gist that I showed there. So if you want to see how I wrote that, it's all there. And it was just, as we talked about, it's just tool making. You'll see there's a bunch of different functions that are different tools of getting a timestamp or getting a transcription result. And then the final commands are just things that bring all those little tools into one big tool. So so it's a fun project.
That is such a fun project, man. And I think it's really cool that you did that. I wish I had access to the logs. I want to hear what kind of silly things I've said. Like, how many times have I said carrots? Is it more than one? Was that the first time we've ever said carrots? I guess that was twice.
Well, we can find out. I mean, I'll be able to get you access. Like, it's still there. So I'll figure out a way to get you some access, and you can play with it. Again, that's also in my MVP subscriptions. I actually have the subscription name. I call it MVP on steroids, which is my favorite aspect of that. But basically, like it's a pretty large bucket of money that they give me to just experiment with stuff as an MVP. And so that was just one of the things that I did. So yeah, I can happily give you access, and just don't use it commercially and go to town.
Yeah, I will not. I will also say to you, good sir, that one of the most heavily recommended people is you on the podcast, like your modules, or I often hear so often that people love your episodes where we go deep and cover a lot of things like this, because you really do have cool projects. I mean, the two you just described, ModuleFast, the ways you went about optimizing it and breaking it down. I mean, I think it's really cool, and it speaks to how good you are both at architecting, but also you have the hands-on experience to also execute, because with ModuleFast, there's a lot of moving parts. And I think for me, I can understand how you went about it, but earlier in my career, I'd be like, how on earth could someone do it? But I think it's helped, it's aided by the fact you already know all the technologies and what they do, and how they could tie together. So it's not like you're flying in the dark. You have some experience as to what's going to go on, and you have a lot of coding and hands-on experience where you can actually implement it. Is that fair to say? Because I think a lot of people are going to be like, whoa, one person did that project. That is mind melting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does come from everything before. I mean, I think I talked about it on here before, but like, I got my start in basic like Cisco networking in high school. I mean, obviously but in like my career progression, that kind of stuff, and like networking and looking at a Cisco config file. I still remember the first time I looked at one. I'm just like, I have no idea what any of this does. It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm never going to be able to learn this. But then like I learned networking, and then like I learned servers, and Novell NetWare was kind of what I cut my teeth on. And then after I got through those basics, in fact, when I was younger, like there was this big book that I got that was like an illustrated thing of how computers work, and it went into like detail, like how a CPU works, like how memory works, and it had all these big detailed like cross sections and like slice diagrams, and it didn't make, I was reading it when I was like 13 or 14, and like I didn't understand all of it, but I kind of like, oh, this is really interesting. And like, once you just understand those pieces, then things just domino from there. Like storage networking, learning fiber channel and iSCSI. It's like, oh, once I got into it, oh, this stuff is very similar. It's like WWNs are just like MAC addresses, more or less, and the way packets move are just like Ethernet, more or less, or token ring, more or less, maybe a little more deterministic. That kind of thing. And then as I got into programming, like I kind of really, first thing I ever learned was like HyperCard when I was a kid on Macs. And then you get into like PowerShell, and PowerShell is the first thing I really, really learned beyond like Visual Basic. And I learned some Java in college and that kind of thing. But PowerShell is the first thing I ran with, and then learned Go and C# and that kind of thing. Just as I have a project, I want to do this. And like Go seems like the best way to do that. So I'm going to learn that. TypeScript, I learned purely pretty much for making VS Code extensions. And now I know a lot about TypeScript and can make all kinds of things with it. So that, again, that's a long tangent way of saying is that with ModuleFast is just a culmination of a lot of experience I have. I know NuGet version 2 from doing all kinds of PowerShell gallery queries on the back end, and like actually using the V2 API and learning all about OData, which I learned OData from some other thing that I had to do when I was interacting with like SOAP APIs a long ass time ago. And then there's things about like, okay, how modules install. I've always actually looked at the file system. How does a module install? And from writing modules, how do they go down? And what is this weird XML file that psgit puts in the folder? Like, what is that for? And how does that interact? And breaking things constantly. Like, why doesn't this work? Why doesn't that work? Beating my head against it for hours and just be like, oh, that was really silly. Well, now I know that. So I would have had that problem 30 times over, except now I remember, oh, I know what that problem is. And it only takes me 2 seconds to fix as opposed to 3 hours. All that kind of stuff, knowing how networks work, knowing how packets work, knowing how all that. So knowing how to best optimize them, knowing how HTTPS works, understanding how SSL works and how the protocols work, how the handshakes work. So that using HTTP2 or HTTP3, which ModuleFast uses, how that cuts down on the time and the handshakes because it only has to be one TCP connection and not a TCP connection for every download, and multiplexing those streams. And just having interest in those things. I know that sounds like a lot. It's like, and it is like, I wouldn't expect somebody, 6 months into PowerShell to be able to, look at ModuleFast and just be like, oh yeah, I could have wrote that, But this is, I've been doing this like 15 years. And even then, like there's so much that I struggle with ModuleFast and so much that I learned that I can apply to other things. And that never stops. That's true of any kind of development type stuff, which I consider PowerShell development. Scripting development doesn't matter. There's no difference to me. And so that's just kind of how that kind of thing comes about, and how a lot of these things that I come up with, little projects, I can just do them fast because the majority of it, I'm standing on the shoulders of either stuff I've done before or stuff other people have done. And the stuff that takes me the most time is what the uncharted territory that I'm jumping into. So like that's the biggest message that I can say is like, if you're impressed by the stuff that I do and don't think you could ever do it, you can. It just takes time. And I have a broad knowledge to be able to do things in a lot of different areas. That doesn't mean you have to. You can focus solely like on the Teams API and write a module that's going to be far better than anything I'm going to write because you live in that day to day, like for your work. And a lot of the works that I do are surface deep, but they don't, are surface enough to solve the problem that I need to solve, but they're not a comprehensive tool for that thing because I'm in and I'm out and I got to go do something else. But if you live day in, day out, you can make a module that blows the pants off anything I've ever made for ServiceNow or whatever, So that's I think the main takeaway is just use the knowledge that you have to build forward. And I as one side note to that, that's also kind of how I progress my career. I tend to be very careful about the products that I select, like, because in an MSP, you can pretty much do anything. You can choose to specialize in anything as long as there's demand for it, as long as your customers have it. You can find the niche for yourself and become the specialist of that area. And we look for those. But for instance, like, I didn't choose to become like a Jive specialist. I try to avoid very niche tools, because while there can be very lucrative in the short term, because there's not a lot of people that do that thing, by having that niche experience, when that thing goes away, especially if it's subject matter that's specific to that product, that is just gone. Whereas like learning NetWare and then learning Windows and knowing like, okay, file systems all kind of work the same, and then learning VMware, it's like, okay, these are things just on top of that, and VMware transitioning into Azure and realizing like, okay, I kind of see a lot of this on-prem thing going away, but the knowledge that I have of VMware translates to Azure very well. Like, it's all just virtual machines again, at least in one part of Azure. Being able to take that knowledge and build on it is, in my opinion, it's just what's worked for me for my career and what I find the most enjoyable and allows me to adapt really quickly. But at the same time, like when you see something coming down the road, for me, it was Azure, and just being like, and I remember like when back when Microsoft 365 was BPOS, like the business process optimization services. And I looked at this thing, I'm like, this is never going to work. Like, people don't have the internet connections for this. They don't have the storage for this. Like, this is a terrible, like, why would you ever do this? And I had no belief in that ever working. And then 5-6 years down the road, Exchange Online really makes it, which was always like the worst thing in a network to manage. And by actually building a solution to take that away and have it work pretty well, I started to see the light on that. And then things with Azure, and I had started on AWS, but then I really saw Azure. I was like, this is where I want to go, and this is where I want to be. And that was a really hard learning curve, because Azure abstracts so much stuff away from you that all these knowledges that I have, some things get flipped upside down. Things like Azure networking just get flipped upside down. Like, the way that Azure networking works is very counterintuitive if you are a very seasoned network expert. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't make any sense. It's like, why doesn't it just work this way? Or why doesn't it just work that way? That you have to like unprogram from yourself. And for me, it's just adapting for those. And so, the advice I tend to give people is just, you can kind of go either way, and it just depends on what kind of person you are, what you want to work on. I know what's worked for me, and there's things that have worked for other people, and what's worked for me isn't going to work for others. But it's the old cheesy of like, find your passion. Is that I find my passion every like 3 months. Like, I get bored really easy, and documentation is such a chore for me, but I do it because I know it's important. But I still hate it. I absolutely hate it, because I'm working on stuff that I've already done. I'm just reiterating the stuff that I've already done. And I know it's important for the support of those things, but I want to get on to the next thing. And that's just how I work.
I'd say if you want to be technical like Justin, find a role where you can be hands-on and seek out opportunities to actually learn what's going on. Don't just do the bare minimum, Be curious. You can do really cool things over time. I also want to shout out your HTML module, Power HTML, new update to that recently. Congratulations.
Yeah. The best, worst module I've ever created.
Yeah, I mean, that thing's
it is far
up.
and away my most. So the reason it's far and away my most, it always reminds me of, like bands and stuff, or comedy bits. Actually, they always say like, they come up with like skits and stuff that people put on YouTube, and they're really proud of it. It gets like nothing, and then they just do some little throwaway thing, and it's massively viral. And they're like, "What, that thing? Like, that's what people want?" And that's how I feel about Power HTML. It's like, Power HTML is basically just a wrapper around a thing called the HTML Agility Pack, which basically lets you screen scrape HTML. But the reason it's so popular is because it fills a niche, which is in PowerShell 5.1. When you use the invoke REST web request and invoke REST method, it would screen scrape the HTML for you into objects. That's because it could use the IE engine to do that. PowerShell 7 was cross-platform, so those two tools got rewritten to be cross-platform, not using the IE engine anymore. And so that piece just kind of went away. You couldn't do it. But that was still a very big need, is screen scraping APIs. I mean, we all wish we had really nice REST APIs, but that's just not always the case. So you do still have to screen scrape from time to time. And so to do that, HTML Agility Pack provides a really nice way to do the same thing that used to do, which is take some raw HTML that's coming in and convert it into PowerShell objects that are manipulatable, .NET objects technically. So all that thing is just a wrapper around that. It just has one command, convert HTML, that just takes whatever HTML you're passing it and sticks it into that module, and out comes the objects. But the objects have all kinds of methods and stuff on them, so they're much more powerful there. But it's not like a suite of command lists that lets you do all that stuff. It should be. I just don't care enough to do it. But it's enough that's there that it solves a niche. And so people do that, and especially probably in pipelines when they're testing, when they need to grab some web page and verify that it works. So that module has been downloaded 1 million times. Probably 700,000 of those is some person running a GitHub action or something over and over and over again every time they test it. So it's not a complicated module. If you go in there and you look at it, it's very simple, but it serves a purpose and it's popular. And not all modules have to be ModuleFast. Like ModuleFast is a cool piece of technology that does some funky, clever stuff. But my most popular module is something that a 2-month PowerShell person could have written. Like, it's literally just a function. And if you understood how a .NET library works, or enough to understand their code, you can make PowerHTML. Go look at the code sometime. Like, it is not complicated. And it had a recent release, as you mentioned, and I didn't write that release. As I mentioned, it's so popular. I don't care. I hardly ever use it. But it's out there for people to use. But shout out to, and I'm going to butcher their names. Go to the GitHub, and I'd have to pull it up here. But
Andy Svensson
on the GitHub. Thank you very much. Yeah. So they between the two of them as well as others, they just made a pull request. They're like, hey, we like this. We want the newer version of the HTML Agility Pack so we can do some new fancy stuff with it, as well as keep pace with changes. So they made a pull request, and I reviewed it, and I made a few changes, and I added some additional tests to make sure it works the way it should. But for the most part, it was there, and I merged it and released that new version, and there it is. But the vast majority of that work I didn't do. That was done by those two guys, and great community contribution. And now PowerHTML is better just because they added to it. So go open source.
Loves to see it. Let's go. That's the whole point of it. So if you're not on GitHub and haven't messed around with Git yet, get some exposure. No pun intended. And congrats on 1.3 million downloads on PowerHTML. That is pretty cool. Now,
on the subject of open source too,
yes.
I'm going to interrupt. There's one thing I did want to mention, which I'm very proud of, is I finally am now listed as an official contributor to the core PowerShell repo. I got a pull request merged. I'm so proud. It only took like 6 months.
Congrats.
It's a very simple pull request. What it is that if you use the preview version now and 7.5 when it comes out, in an error message, any error message you get, there's a field there called recommended action. That if a module user, somebody's bothered to fill it in, like say you get an error that's red text, like this thing couldn't be found. It is possible for a module author or any kind of commandlet author to put in there a recommended action, like did you make sure your network was connected, or did you remember to do connect AZ account first? To put in some kind of recommendation to fix your problem. So what I did is I just made a pull request that now surfaces that in the default view, so that if you are if you run a command that has that, you'll see, like, for instance, it'll say like could not connect this thing, or an unexpected error occurred. And on a new line, if a recommended action is there, it'll say recommended action, here's what we recommend you do. It could be a link to a knowledge base article or something like that. So it always drove me crazy that one field never got used, but it was like a chicken and egg problem of it never got used because it was never surfaced. Nobody ever saw it, so who cares? But if nobody ever sees it, why bother populating it? So I went to the trouble to make it so that now it's populated, and hopefully more and more modules will start. When you do like a write error, if you're writing a script-based module, you'll notice one of the parameters is -recommended action. So you can write your own for that to show up. So look for that in the preview release and the new one. But yeah, I'm very happy about that. That now makes me an official PowerShell contributor to the official PowerShell repo. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an accomplishment right there. That is an exciting thing, especially as a PowerShell lover, to kind of be listed on that page.
It feels good. It feels good. It feels very, very good.
I do have a question. So you've written a lot of modules. You have a great workflow. You go fast, ModuleFast. What are some tips and tools you use to write modules quickly? What's kind of your workflow? I know you're big on VS Code. Is there any features that you're kind of leveraging?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. Like I had kind of a bell curve with modules. Like you're just kind of learning modules and you write them and you hand write the manifests and all that kind of stuff, and you learn how to publish. And then you get to a point where you start going up, you feel like you're getting good, and you get pretty confident, like, oh, I'm going to automate this stuff. I'm going to make like a GitHub action that auto publishes stuff and does all that stuff. And I spent countless hours writing this module called Press that did everything. It would use Git version to automatically determine your version based on your release notes. It would take multiple files and merge them together. Basically all the stuff that things like Module Builder or what's the one that Gale has, Sampler. There's all those ways. Like I made my own one of those, and I love it. It's called Press. It's still out there. It's completely incomprehensible to anybody but me. Like it is not for somebody external to use, but it makes for some really pretty GitHub actions. And I would use that all the time. So you'll see most of my repos like 3-4 years ago, we're using that. And you see this really beautiful workflow of building modules. And every time I commit, all the checks it runs and pester and everything. But now I don't use that anymore because I let it kind of lax and I got to go back and fix it. And every time I start a new module, I'm like, I just want to get this thing done and published. So now I've kind of gone back to I just use new module manifest and I write the thing. I'm not really big on multiple files anymore because with VS Code, you have things like the outline view and such and jump to definition that having the separate file for each function just isn't as important to me as it used to be. So like ModuleFast, it's a huge like 5,000 line file, but because of the way that I can jump between functions and jump, if I see a definition, jump to it, having separate files like I used to is just not as important to me as it used to be. So just having it, and it makes testing easier and debugging easier. Like PowerShell doesn't have a concept of source maps. So if I'm testing the loaded module, half the time I'll go make a change in that module. And then when I go to deploy, I lost my changes and I lose time. So more and more, I just write one file, one manifest and work on that. And I'll add pester tests to that too. And then if it's something I'm going to use for a while, then I'll add on some GitHub actions and stuff to test for pull requests and such. But for the most part, I started like simple, complicated, and I'm kind of like just back to simple again because the scaffolding time to get all that scaffolding in. If I would just take the time to do it, then it would be fast again with all the scaffolding. But I just haven't bothered. It's like I just haven't been willing to invest the time to fix all that stuff up and get myself a good flow for that. I just make modules now and just write them and publish them. And, I'm pretty ashamed of that, but hey, it's just getting stuff done, which is what we do with PowerShell. So fast and loose. We're not writing C# programs here. Yeah,
not usually, but I'm glad you said that because I have that approach of I went through the whole using all these things to kind of template it out, and now I just do PSM1, PSD1, keep it simple. Because I know a step in the sort of build process for a module, if you were to use separate files per function, is putting them together. So with, like you're saying about VS Code, the new features, you can kind of click around pretty easily. Might as well just use one file. And my modules aren't that big anymore, like maybe a few hundred lines.
And don't get me wrong, these are the modules where I am we are a development team of one, where it's just me messing around most of the time. Anything that I'm going to have contributors, like all of our internal work modules, they have the full structure. They have separate folders. Because I have to think about the other guy. I have to think about the guy who's coming into this and doesn't want to see a wall of text. They want to be able to go to that file and see that thing because that's kind of what they've been trained in and that kind of thing. And so all the goofy stuff that I do in my personal modules is not the stuff that I do in our corporate standard modules or modules that I have that have multiple contributors. So that's a key distinction I want to make is that the reason those things are fast and loose is because it's just me and I don't have to think about the next guy.
Fair enough. And shout out to Dylan B from Discord for that question. I have another one from Josh Hendricks, where do you find the time? How do you fit developing modules into your workflow? I know you kind of mentioned it a little bit where you're sort of solving problems that use these or you encounter them and your workflow is pretty quick. So implementing them isn't that hard since you've done it so many times. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. So it's kind of summarize like where do I find the time to write modules when I'm having to deal with day-to-day work? It's pretty straightforward. I shoehorn my day-to-day work to become modules. Is that so? Yeah. This is again, as an MSP, the nice thing is that it's such a large space, and we have teams to handle things. Is that a lot of people are subject matter experts, but I've been with the same company for 15 years, so I've had the chance to sort of shape where I want to be in that company. And so I have a lot of autonomy that a lot of people don't have in terms of what I select and what I do. So I can, if there's something I'm interested in and I want to do, it's pretty simple. Like I'll be on a call with a customer, that kind of thing. Like there's an integration that needs to be done. It's like, And, that could get thrown over the wall to software development and they do that, or they could get thrown over the wall to, the guys who are going to write it in C# or Java and do a whole thing and be 6 months. I'd be like, that sounds like an interesting challenge. Like, I'll be like, I'm going to take that as part of my workflow, like as long as I'm demonstrating enough value to justify my salary, then that works that way in our company. It's like, if stuff isn't on fire, and thanks to PowerShell and tools like that to automate things, like the wonderful thing about an MSP is you can take solutions and help cookie cutter things to, once you solve it for one company, you can force multiply that across multiple companies and save everybody a ton of time and cut down a huge swath of issues of people just doing things over and over and over again. That, when things aren't on fire, then I have these times where places I can improve our company. And almost 90% of the time, that's how can I use PowerShell to do that? Because that's what I want to do. I'm not thinking like, how can I write this in F#? I love F#, but it's incomprehensible to my company. It's not useful or supportable. So I want to write it in something that's easy to maintain and that we have an ecosystem around. And so I just shoehorn my way into all these things and just like, oh, we need an API for that. We need an integration for that. I'll get in on that and write that, or get in on that and write that, or join this team and help them out with their aspect there. Or if there's just a little thing like, oh, we need an Excel report for this thing. Currently, they're doing 3 hours doing all these things and one person is manually typing it up. I'm like, can they export a CSV? It's like, yeah. I was like, send those to me. I'll write it up for you and I'll fix it for you and solve that team's problem. Again, that's mostly where I find I do my best value is I'm looking for inefficiencies in our entire company, every step of our processes and pipelines and such like that. If I can find a place where I can really, improve either improve those people's lives and their values so their morale goes up, or cut down the time that they're doing things so that their costs go down, therefore, our margins go up. That's what I'm going to do. And that's where I'm going to demonstrate value to my company, demonstrate value to my employer, and justify my salary. So finding that time is a matter of that it's built into what I do, is that my company knows that like 30% of my time might just be, I'm just over here just whacking away at a keyboard and something might not even show up, but probably something will. Whereas the other time is dealing with customers and our time is dealing with problems and putting out fires and writing documentation and all that kind of stuff. And then there's the stuff that I write in my personal life that is just, I usually have some hours in a day. Like I have time that I'm playing with friends, I have time that I'm working on stuff, time that I'm spending with my partner, time that I'm spending with my dog. Walking my dog every day for an hour at lunch. He doesn't let me get away with that for sure. But just here and there is just like, I got an hour here, 2 hours there. It's like where people I'll watch a lot of TV shows, but I don't watch nearly as much. I play a lot of video games, but I don't play nearly as much. It's just those times when I would be doing those things. It's sort of a relaxation time for me. It's a way of how can I take some time and occupy my brain on this thing that I've just always wanted to do and maybe see if I can get to work or not and learn something. And so, but I spend more time than probably most do. Like I would say I spend probably somewhere between 12 to 14 hours a week doing something in PowerShell, whether it's personal or work related. So that's probably a lot more than most people, especially if you're just learning. Like most people maybe have like 2 to 4 hours a week to spend. And especially like, again, I don't have kids. That's a huge thing. Is like, if I had kids, that would be a third at most. So that's just an aspect of how my life has worked out. That for those that are trying to become PowerShell experts and have a whole family to juggle and everything like that, my heart goes out to you because I see people who do the whole gamut and can still maintain, a life and have all that fulfillment. And I just find that incredible. My heart's out to those people for sure. So
always a good reminder to not compare ourselves to others and just focus on our own improvement, because we all have different things going on. Different between people, but some great tidbits. Justin, I have a couple more questions, but one very deep burning question that I have to get out. And that is, what is the best animated TV series?
Oh my God. The problem with these best questions, like what genre are we talking about here? Are we talking about anime? Are we talking about like, so the new style? Are we talking about like old?
We're in your world, man. Take us for a trip.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. Well, off the top of the immediate thought off the top of my head is Cowboy Bebop. It's just
okay.
But that's formative year type stuff. I mean, that's something that I saw when I was young, and I'd never seen anything like that before. And it's just core memory built in. But even now, as I watch it, it is just a force of nature. It was so different from everything else that came before it. It just told a story in a style that just you weren't ready for, and just not you were used to certain tropes, and it just broke all these tropes. And and of course, anything Shinichiro Watanabe does, like Samurai Champloo after that, and the movie and such. Like, I mean, that to me quintessential. Like, there's nobody that doesn't like Cowboy Bebop. I've never met a single person that's like, I mean, like, I didn't get it. It was silly. Like, there's parts of it that are absolutely silly, but as a whole, if you watch the whole thing, it's great. And like, I'm of the controversial opinion, I thought the live action was great too. Like, for its own things, there's some things I wish they hadn't have done, but at the same time, like, I very much respected that work. I didn't think it was. I thought it was actually really well done and very true to the art.
Gosh.
Number two, like, it was like I was a big fan of the original animated X-Men, and the new X-Men '97 is fantastic. Like, it's so well done. A new entry recently that I watched that really floored me, and I really have to say is in my top 5, is Blue Eye Samurai. Blue Eye Samurai, just the art style, the art direction, the content, the flow of it, really wowed me. Like, I thought I couldn't be surprised anymore, and it really surprised me. Beyond that, I mean, God, it's such a list that I can't say. I mean, best, I'll stop there. I mean, just best for me is just Cowboy Bebop. I wouldn't say it's objectively the best. It's my favorite, and and a lot of that has to do with it being a core memory type thing. It introduced me to so much in my life and made so many friends as a result of it that it means so much to me.
That's so cool, man. I'm gonna have to check that out because I have not watched any Cowboy Bebop. I'm sorry.
And it's great. You're in for a treat because it's fairly short. It's like, I think it's like 26 half-hour episodes or something like that. So you can knock it out. And, and for being, God, 30 years old now, I think there's also a movie. The movie is excellent too. And the thing is, the movie takes place, I would watch the show, then watch the movie. But if you really want to be a stickler, I think you get up to around episode 20 and then you watch the movie. And that's about the time where the movie takes place in the order of things. And so, but yeah, I mean, I'd highly recommend it. It's great. But if you can't get into the art style and any of that kind of stuff, I mean, Blue Eye Samurai is very new. It's wonderful, and I highly recommend that one too. I mean, I could recommend a billion things, but those would be the top of my head.
I have a question from Discord user Fortress. If you could go back in time, what skills would you focus on earlier in your career?
Is this knowing what I know now?
Yeah.
Honestly, I got really lucky. Not a lot. I mean, the biggest thing that I got really lucky with was when I was a freshman in high school. Actually, no, sorry. When I was in junior high, we got the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation handed out all these huge grants. And one of them was like to all the schools to revamp their architectures. I talked about this last time, so I won't rehash it. But basically, like, getting in so early and being given this opportunity not a lot of people get was huge. And being able to do all that stuff, being able to play with stuff for real. I would say, like, if I was starting today, you are so lucky because you don't have to, you don't have to have a $30,000 SAN to play with to learn. I mean, you have Azure. Like, you can get a free account and you have access to 95% of everything anybody would have access to without paying for like a $5,000 class and lab. Like, the walls because of hardware were so high to get into professional IT that now the walls just don't exist. I mean, for certain things, yes, but for the most part, although that. So what skills would I develop earlier? I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say because I don't think I'd be where I am not making the mistakes that I did. Like, one of these things is like, I never got a computer science degree. Like, I never really learned programming from like assembly up kind of a deal. I mean, I kind of did because of that book. So like, I knew from the book thing, but I knew kind of like ideas of instruction sets, but I never went the whole gap between instruction sets to managed code. Up until very recently, like, everything in there was a black box to me up until about a year ago when I really started diving into like how C# allocations work and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I would say, like, I don't know, like, knowing more about, I love static type languages now. Like, there's so much in PowerShell that frustrates me that is just a dream to do with C# or F# or TypeScript, just shifting the whole workflow left. The stuff that used to frustrate me in those languages, like, why does this just work? Why can't I just do 1 + 1? Why do I have to get all these stupid types right? Why can't I just do it like I do in PowerShell? Now I very much appreciate, because like, when I have to do really complicated things, to have it where like I make a change here and without even having to run the code, no, you got to fix this, you need to fix this, you need to fix this, just from the compiler, is a thing of magic that I wish more people in PowerShell could experience if PowerShell had that kind of power. No pun intended. So I think knowing more about those statically typed languages, appreciating them, and being able to integrate them into my workflow. I wish I would have known that better. It's kind of a silly one, but like I wish I would have learned how to become social younger. I really didn't. It's something that I talked about last time again, but like I didn't really become social until my late 20s, early 30s as a result of a real rough breakup. And had I known that those were skills that you could learn, I absolutely would have. And I definitely would have exercised. I mean, I also didn't know, like, I wish I would have known now with all the knowledge about physical stuff. Like, I just wish I would have lifted weights like half hour a day. Like, it's all it takes to drastically change your health style. Like, you don't have to be in the gym for 3 hours a day doing P90X, whatever, or being a gym rat. Like, just having some stuff and having a half hour. Like, I'm down to like 10 minutes a day. I do some real intense 10 minutes, but I just do it at lunch. And it improves so much of my life. That would have been so much better. Confidence, everything when I was younger, that I wish I would have done that. So I can't say like technical skills, but like soft skills and physical skills, I wish I would have contributed more. And again, as I say, like, well, if I would have spent more time in those, I would have spent less time playing video games and doing all that other stuff that made me who I am today. But it could have been just enough knowing what I know now that it wouldn't have impacted those things. I still would have played video games to death and loved it and had it become a part of my identity. Watched the movies that I did, watched the shows that I did, played around with the technologies that I did. But I would have been happier and I would have been healthier and I would have been more social. And I do think overall my life would have been better from my 20s up to my 30s. Actually, even more so from like age 15 to 30. 15 to 20 was really rough. 20 to 24 was a bit better with college, but still pretty rough. And then, so I mean, that would be my main thing, is that it's actually, I wish I could say like, oh, I wish I would have learned Fortran or something really specific and actionable. But the answers that I have are not ones I don't think a lot of people want to hear. Is like, I would have exercised more and I would have been more social. I would have taken more chances with conversations or asking people out or any of that kind of stuff. That's what I would have done more, for sure. Otherwise, I don't have a lot of regrets. So
no, that's some great advice. I have one more question. Where can we find you on the World Wide Web?
I'm pretty much exclusively on Twitter and GitHub. I don't have a LinkedIn, but I noticed like a more and more community is growing there. Oh, and Discord, of course. So I'm on the PowerShell Discord a bunch. I'm on Twitter at twitter.com/Justin W. Grote, because Justin Grote was taken, because I got into the Twitter game way late. But my GitHub is Justin Grote. And I think my LinkedIn is Justin Grote, but I'm never there. I've been thinking of being there more because I see more and more stuff like Barbara there. I've tried the decentralized stuff like Mastodon and that kind of stuff. And I love those communities, but I just don't interact with them as much as I used to, or as I've tried. I can't seem to get a good momentum going there. So most of my stuff's on GitHub. And if you have a question for me, if you @ me on the Discord, I'll probably respond. So that's probably the best place, is the PowerShell Discord.
Heck yeah. Well, Justin, thank you so much for joining us on this lovely episode. And thank you everyone out there for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you're still here with us, consider yourself a friend and hook a friend up. Give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. It helps spreading PowerShell to the world. Justin, thank you again so much for joining today. Long anticipated return. Welcome back. You crushed it. I think we covered a lot of awesome ground. Appreciate your contributions to the community and for the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Andy. And as usual, as I always say, most people listen to podcasts on like 1.5 speed. They'll probably have to move it down to like 0.5 for mine. So. No matter how many times I try to do, I got a big sticker right here that says slow down, and I fail miserably at it. So,
well, we covered a lot of good content, and honestly, I think it worked out really well. Like getting to kind of see the improvements to ModuleFast and explore that in some depth for me was really insightful. So thank you so much, Justin.
And if you have the ability, also all the PowerShell Summit videos are up. So if you want to see all my presentations, they're out there. One thing, there was a lot of fun discussion about the fact that if you look at my feedback provider presentation, I actually only made that a 45-minute presentation. I forgot that it was a 90-minute presentation. So I get 45 minutes in, I wrap it up, and then it was like, oops. They edited the oops out, so they actually made it look pretty seamless that I just went into a demo. And I've actually asked them to put the oops back in, because I think it's kind of important for people to see, like, mess up all the time. But that was a fun demo. The one that Yap and I did was great. We had a lot of fun in there. So definitely, yeah, go back through those PowerShell org videos. They're fantastic. A lot of what I've learned, like my PowerShell game really went to 11 from like from the summit, like 2017, 2018, 2019 videos, like Kirk Monroe's debug presentation.
Yes.
Amazing. That was a light bulb eureka moment watching that. And now I write parts of the VS Code debug portion in the VS Code module. So that started a lot with that because I didn't understand debugging at all. But also, PowerShell PSConf EU is coming up. If you can go, I highly recommend it. But if not, the videos will be online from that too. Always a great time, amazing crowds there. And I reprinted some of Ben Reader PowerShell stickers. I managed to get the design from him. And so I've got these to give out only at PSConf EU. They're very cool. It's my favorite sticker. It's the only sticker on my laptop, on my work laptop, is this sticker. So yeah, come to PSConf EU and check it out. And for those on the podcast, I apologize. Just assume that it's a really cool sticker.
Oh, it was cool.
Whatever you're picturing in your head, it's 10 times better.
And it's shiny. Yeah, it's awesome. I also want to shout out, we're in shout out mode. Okay. Shout out dbatools.ai. So it's a PowerShell module by Chris E. Lemaire that acts as a helpful assistant for SQL Server databases and DBA tools. So some cool stuff in the DBA AI world. Maybe I'll talk to Chrissy in the coming weeks. Also have some more upcoming talks or podcast episodes that are a little bit more PSConf EU focused. So definitely check out that conference if you're in Europe. Check it out. If you're not, still check it out. I'm going to hopefully go next year. Justin, I'm excited for you. Hopefully you take some good photos and share some good stuff on social media so I can be jealous of you.
Yeah, that's my vacation time. So I take the week before, and we always go somewhere else too. So when it was in Vienna, we went all through the Czech Republic. When it was in Prague, we went all through Copenhagen and Berlin. So this year we're going to go to Lisbon, Portugal. At least that's where we're going to start, and then we're going to go wherever from there, and then meet up with a bunch of the PSConf EU crew in Amsterdam. And we're going to have we're going to take the PowerShell train to Antwerp. Excuse me. So yeah. That's going to be a good time. That's going to be a raucous train going from Amsterdam to Antwerp with all the PowerShell people. So I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a great time.
Awesome. Well, Justin, thanks for joining. And if you're driving right now, drive safe. Have a great rest of your day.
Indeed, yes.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.